challenge right now is to discuss the impact of technology, both aggravating, empowering, whether it's irrelevant to some of the questions or not, with regard to foreign fighters, terrorism, the advent of terrorism, social stress, and the broad range of modernization, if you will, and all of that entails in 21st century challenges. We have an outstanding panel, and just to my left, and he'll be speaking to us in Arabic, so prepare yourself. Faisal Mohamed Al-Emadi. Faisal is Executive Director of Programs at Silatech, and leading overall programs initiative across lots of operations. I've done some deep dive into his work, and he's very involved with manpower activities and lots of other nonprofit things which we can get into. Dr. Elisabeth Kendall is a Senior Research Fellow in Arabic and Islamic Studies at Pembroke College at Oxford University. She was in the Washington Post today. You knew that, right? I'm not breaking news to you. Yeah, she was in the Washington Post today talking about really circumstances in Yemen, and we're going to have a deep dive in some of the tectonic dimensions of what's unfolding in Yemen, and hopefully talk a little bit about poetry too, which will be there. So, and we have Eric, I hope we can get it, Rosand? Rosand. Eric, excuse me for negotiating on stage here. Eric Rosand is Director of the Prevention Project and a non-resident Senior Fellow in the Brookings Institution's Foreign Policy Program. And really is, when I delved into his background, he's sort of, if there was a diva in Washington on countering violent extremism, it is you. You just I think, broadly, engaged in so many different projects across so many platforms, and kind of really breaking down something which I hope we get into are the local dimensions, the city dimensions, and how we need a kind of broader set of constituent players in these issues. So, Eric, I look forward to your comments. And David Scharia is the internationally recognized expert on counterterrorism, serves as Chief of Branch at the Counter-Terrorism Committee Executive Directive, CTED, about which we have heard so much at this conference, and is on the law faculty at Tel Aviv University as well. And so look forward to this. And we're all going to speak. Each person is going to offer some tidbits and top-of-mind thoughts. And why don't I start with Eric? Eric, I'm going to ask you to go first to help frame our discussion. So,
thank you. So I have, first, I want to say thank you to all the organizers, in particular the Sufan Center, for bringing this great group together. It's an honor to be here. I have 3 points, 3 examples, and 3 recommendations in hopefully less than 7 minutes.
Perfect.
So the 3 points. First, urbanization is on the rise. Pretty basic point. More than half the world's population currently living in urban areas, and it's projected to rise to 2/3 in the next 30 years. As a result, cities and local governance is going to have increased importance in the dynamic and globalized world we're all living in, and we'll be living in hopefully in 2050. Second point, increasing trend towards decentralization in many countries, including places like Malaysia, Jordan, Tunisia, Kenya, and you can go on. And with the resulting shift away from a centralized approach to governance, this means more mayors and governors will be given mandates and resources that they've rarely had or never had in some cases to respond to the needs of the constituents in ways they never have had to before. Point 3, over the past few years, we've seen an increasing attention to the unique role that states and cities can play across a whole spectrum of global issues. 2 examples of this, testaments to this. This month, mayors from around the globe gathered in Bristol, England, for the 3rd annual Global Parliament of Mayors. More than 100 municipal leaders and officials from around the world gathered in July for the 4th Global Strong Cities Network Summit. The Global Parliament of Mayors is a platform to discuss local challenges to managing a whole range of global problems related to security, health, and migration. And the Strong Cities Network, as some of you may know, was basically founded to help develop and share city-led solutions to the problems of violent extremism, including many of the issues we've been discussing over the last day and a half around the foreign terrorist fighter phenomena. The foreign terrorist fighter issues in particular, and violent extremism more broadly, have historically been considered national security issues, with national governments having a monopoly, in many cases, over the policies, programs, and resources, and thus a monopoly over the solutions, which is in some case the reason why the solution set is perhaps smaller than it needs to be going forward. Yet despite this, we've seen a growing number of cities acting often out of necessity to deal with this problem of foreign terrorist fighters. They were initially started by the number of their citizens who were being radicalized, recruited to travel abroad, and so the focus was on preventing them from going abroad. And now they're confronted with, in some cases, their former citizens, in other cases, citizens from other parts of the globe trying to enter or come to their cities. People return to cities often more than countries. We have to keep that in mind. And again, cities have started to act on their own, often despite, more often despite than because of national level engagement. That said, we're slowly starting to see that more and more countries at the national level are starting to realize that cities have critical roles to play here. And this is really the key point, is that the numerous comparative advantages that cities have over national and certainly global actors on the issues we've been talking about the last day and a half are numerous. Whether it's in identifying and steering individuals away from extremists and other forms of violence, cities are closest to the citizens, closest to the problems. Whether it's to tackle the social polarization that is starting to, around preventing extremism, hate, Islamophobia, preventing Islamophobia from taking root, preventing hate from taking root, as some of the stresses that we'll be talking about on this panel are intensifying. Again, cities have a real advantage here. Whether it's managing situations before they turn to violence or de-escalating situations after violence, cities are key. And most practically, cities have no choice. Mayors have no choice but to do stuff. They can't and often aren't sort of encumbered by the politics at the global level, the national level, the bureaucracies at the national level and global level that prevent sort of a multi-dimensional response to multi-dimensional problems. Silos are fewer, and timelines are shorter, again, often by necessity. So those are the three issues, and I guess quickly there also, it's many of the services, many of the social services, many of the mental health services, many of the education services that and family counseling services, et cetera, that a lot of the returnees and their families and their communities need in order to mitigate the risks associated with phenomena are located at the municipal or other subnational levels. And when they're not, they often should be or need to be, and that's where we're seeing the whole decentralization effort link up here and the pushing down of governance to the local levels. So three examples of what cities, very specific examples of what cities are doing here and ways they're contributing. And I'll move from the sort of micro to the more macro. Micro level example one, and we've heard about this a lot over the last few panels, is they are designing and implementing multi-agency intervention programs or panels to deal with individuals often before they become radicalized to violence, but in some cases, those who've returned from Iraq and Syria or other conflict zones cannot be prosecuted for various reasons and need some form of non-criminal intervention. And a lot of these, a number of cities around the world are starting to develop these programs. The most famous one, perhaps, and also the first one when you list it in alphabetical order, is in Aarhus, Denmark. That's been talked about a lot, but it's just one example of how this is working. A number of Canadian cities are using what they call situation tables that allow different municipal level actors, from the police to the mental health services, to the NGOs, to the community leaders to sit around a table and discuss individual cases and then tailor appropriate interventions to those cases. Again, at-risk individuals linked to some form of violent extremism and trying to steer them off the path away from violence. In Australia, we're seeing the government of New South Wales develop a juvenile, through the Juvenile Justice Agency, develop a program to deal with a handful of young people who've returned from Iraq and Syria, and they don't want to put them in jail, and they want to find some other way of engaging with them. Again, they've created at the state level, a multi-agency program to deal with those returnees. The example two, one of the common example one is what had been a very Western approach, a very sort of industrialized approach where you have a lot of capacity at the municipal level to deal with these issues, and you're able to then develop these multi-agency programs. You have the resources, you have the mandate from the national government. That's starting to change a little bit. You're starting to see some programs pop up, slightly different in form, but still pop up in places like Jordan and Lebanon, less focused on sort of individualized interventions, but more on group-based or community-focused programs, but again, around prevention. Again, linked more broadly to efforts to
Eric, hold it a little closer.
Efforts to deal with the risks associated with returning foreign fighters. And example two is again broader-based, along these lines, a much broader-based program that's more focused on maintaining social cohesion, building social cohesion in communities that are particularly prone to feeling the stresses of the foreign terrorist fighter phenomena, whether it's members of the community leaving or returning, or simply the conflict itself creating some upheaval in the community. And so, in New South Wales, the Community Action Partnership or Compact program that's run out of the Agency for Multicultural Affairs set up a really well-resourced grant-making, networking program for community-based organizations to work with the police, to work with NGOs, soccer clubs, youth clubs, to develop all sorts of youth engagement, social cohesion programs, again, explicitly designed to counter violent extremism. Again, the link is links between social cohesion and reducing the stresses around violent extremism and
and we're almost there.
And then the third, and then we'll get to the three quick recommendations. The third example is even broader. It's around urban design, urban planning. Again, most don't associate this with violent extremism per se, or CVE per se, but a number of cities are looking at issues of open spaces for dialogue, for diverse views to be shared, safe spaces for different views to be shared, and we're seeing that take root in a number of cities. Finally, three recommendations. Again, from big to small. The small one is, but actually I think the most important is mental health professionals and mental health capacities. And I think we haven't talked about this enough throughout the last day and a half, and I think this is a real gap in the architecture for prevention around the world. And everyone has spoken about the trauma associated with a lot of the conflicts that the returnees and their families are linked with, but we're not, again, talking about, do the environments in which they're returning to have the mental health professionals, the psychosocial care, community-based services in this area to support the returnees? And in most cases, the answer is no. And I don't think we've given enough thought to that. And this links to, I guess, my friend David talking about the UN, a lot of alphabet soup in the UN context, different acronyms of UN actors. One acronym we rarely hear about in the context of CVE or PVE or counterterrorism is the World Health Organization. So World Health Organization, last point, is national-local collaboration. And we, again, the fact that we're having a conversation about these global problems, lots of national government officials here, lots of people talking about communities, talking about cities, but very few people from communities and from cities here to talk about it and engage directly with national level actors. needs to be done.
Before I jump to David, let me ask you just a couple of quick questions. Eric, thank you so much for that survey. And I would tell people, if you want a much deeper dive into some of Eric's thinking, I love the pieces that you've been publishing in the Lawfare blog. Lawfare is a great reservoir of perspectives that you've had there. What I'm interested in, we're talking about foreign fighters here, but you also deal with a kind of broad array of radicalization and counter-violence initiatives, and you've been very critical of the U.S. government in the wake of the Pittsburgh murders that just took place, in terms of programs that were shut down. And, the efforts to, identify many of the things you just talked about with regard to foreign fighters could apply to other forms of radicalization, like neo-Nazis in the United States. And I wonder if you might want to say a word about that, because I found that useful to think about other dimensions and way we think about some of these questions only in an Islamic context. But I think you're trying to break out of that, and I'd love to hear that now.
Sure. I think in the U.S. we tend to unfortunately see Islamist violent extremism as a violence apart, or treat it differently from other forms of ideologically or politically motivated violence, and there's no real evidence to support that other than politics, to support that delineation, and it undermines our ability to actually deal with the problem of Islamist inspired violence in the United States. And I think that it undermines the ability to connect quote-unquote CVE efforts in the U.S., to the extent they exist anymore, with broader-based crime prevention, violence prevention programs, inhibits the ability to get practitioners from across the spectrum at the local level, the mental health providers, social service providers, engaged in a preventative effort around Islamist-related violent extremism, let alone the broader spectrum. So I think going forward, my hope is, although I don't expect my hope to be met, that someone in Washington will wake up to the fact that we have a significantly greater domestic terrorism, domestic extremism problem than we do an Islamist extremism problem, and that we have to do a much better job about thinking about this as an interconnected set of issues and creating a prevention architecture bottom up with support from the federal government to do that. And I think we'll be in a slightly better place going forward.
Thank you. David, you have been out there quoted as saying that terrorists use technology to further radicalization, incitement, recruitment, and training broadly, and you've kind of put down a marker that we've got to deal with the technology dimension. So what's going on in the international front with CTED and the UN? And tell us what's great, and tell us what you guys aren't succeeding in doing as you share your thoughts.
We have only 6 minutes for the things we're not succeeding. I don't think that's enough. I want to start with, I wasn't planning to, but I think Eric raised very important dimension of where we're going when we're thinking about terrorism, counterterrorism, CVE in the future, and that is the role of cities. And this is where probably the problems and the solutions will come for more and more. And this is due to several reasons, beyond what Eric just mentioned. And I would like to add 2 more points to that. First, cities are becoming more and more a form of identity. People say, who are you? I'm from New York, I'm from London, I'm from Paris, I'm from this city. And the city becomes a source of pride, a source of who they are, sometimes more than what their form of identity relating to the country they're coming from.
Right.
And specifically in divided societies, people will say, I come from this city or that city. That is an important factor when you think about dealing with radicalization or de-radicalization, where cities can be an opportunity to reach out to people and disengage them from activities that you may not wish necessarily to support. So this is one point.
Does that work if you say, I am from Sana'a? We'll get to you in a minute.
Yeah. We'll wait with that. But I think there is an opportunity here, an opportunity by the fact that people I see themselves as part of a city more and more than they may be seeing themselves part of a national system. And that is because of the growing role that cities play. It also means that cities need to do more and can do more by themselves. And what we're maybe seeing, if we move beyond the national, we could see, I think there's a nice term called global localization. We could take actions at the global level and see their impact or their implementation at the very at the very local level. In small cities, in small villages, if the message is coherent and calibrated enough, cities can take action and can play an important role in supporting our global counterterrorism or CVE efforts. More broadly on the issue of technology, I would say that for many years, counterterrorism and terrorism were a low-tech industry. Terrorists did not very much were in need of technology. They were committing their acts as the weapon of the weak, without resorting much to technology. And counterterrorism has growingly become more and more sophisticated, but what we have seen in the last 3 years is an explosion of technology being used by both terrorists and by counterterrorism apparatus. The most interesting dimension of it from our perspective is the paradigm shift that the Security Council took. And for the first time in the in the history, the Security Council called member states to integrate technology into their counterterrorism efforts. So it's not just part of your toolkit. Member states are now required, and legally required, to use biometric technology, to use advanced passenger information in their aviation security efforts. They are required to protect their critical infrastructure, including their from cyber attacks. This is something that never existed before, and it raises enormous amount of questions that we're struggling with. And the questions that we are struggling with is, I could give you a few, but you stop me where you want. Is it good to go to a country which has very little capacity, to sell them biometric technology, which is a very intrusive technology, knowing that the country doesn't have in place the safeguards and the oversight mechanisms that will make that use responsible? One question, in a completely different topic. Member states are required to prevent terrorists from using the internet.
So what you're saying, just to be clear, is you're saying that biometric information can be used for evil rather than good?
It could be used in a very intrusive way if it's not handled responsibly, in full compliance with all the human rights safeguards. Right. And when the stop-down push comes from, our job as a CTED is to make sure that all the safeguards are in place when member states are running to use this technology. As I said, another area, member states are required to prevent terrorists from using the internet. How do you make sure that they do it while respecting freedom of expression and not clamping down on every message that is being used against the government? And on the other hand, how do you make sure that the technology companies are part of the solution and making them wanting to do more, and they are capable to do more, and recently we are seeing them doing more. I could go on to other areas, but in each area, when technology becomes part of the solution, it immediately raised numerous questions, beginning with issues of capacity, issues of responsible use, new questions of human rights and relating to this implementation of these technologies. And the interesting fact is that this is not only a challenge at the global level, it's also very much a challenge on the national level. And I could give you one example, and perhaps you take it from there. A colleague of mine shared with me that some few years ago he was asked by his government to develop export regulations for the selling of drones. He convened an interministerial agency and they sat together, and for 3 years they developed export regulations for the selling of drones.
Right.
But one thing has changed between the time they sat down and the time they came out with the regulation. When they sat down, a drone was cost around $500,000 and was sold only by military companies, military equipment companies. When they finished their work, drones could be bought with the same technology, $500 at Amazon. So the gap between the fast way that technology moves and the ability of governments, not to mention regulation at the international level,
Right.
and developing standards for this is only growing, and we're trying to catch up.
Before I jump to Elisabeth, can I just ask you, and Eric, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think I read a piece where you wrote about our current obsession with messaging, the propaganda, the slick videos, and the massive investments that both the U.S. government and other governments are trying to make in the counter piece of it. And I think, Eric, you said there's not a lot of research to show that that is what radicalizes, and this may be a misplaced investment. Is that sort of near the truth? And so my question to you is, as you look at the resources you have, and I know that you've also written about the technology companies need to get more in line with government on the messaging, I just want to challenge you with what Eric shared in his piece. How do you get the equation right? When you look at an ecosystem and you want to move it in a healthier direction with the kinds of things, what's say the first three priorities? And is that, I know that from the media perspective, our focus is on that set of questions. That's where the pressure is on Facebook and Twitter and all of that. The question is whether that really gets at some of the dimensions that are driving the violence and extremism that could be useful in turning that around. So just quick thought.
So I would say the following. First,
and do you agree with Eric, by the way?
Yeah, I always agree with Eric.
Okay.
3 years ago, we developed a wonderful initiative with the big four companies, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and Twitter, to try to deal with the problem of terrorist use of the internet. The beauty of it was that it was led by the companies themselves. It wasn't governments who told them to take down. It wasn't governments deciding on who is allowed to be using their platforms. So the four companies work together, and they work together on several fronts. For anyone who is interested to learn more, it's called the Global Internet Forum on Counter-Terrorism. First, adopting a common terms of service for using their platforms, meaning no terrorists can use the platform to promote terrorist agenda. Second, they developed together technological tools like machine learning and artificial intelligence to be able to take down content before it's uploaded. And third thing they've done is to create hashing technology, the same technology that is used for child pornography, so that if a video is taken down from Facebook, nobody can upload it on YouTube. And that is wonderful. The fourth thing they've done, which we are playing a more and more dynamic role in this, is to reach out to smaller companies and smaller platforms to make sure that all this know-how is being used by them. Which leads me to the bigger problem that we have when it comes to their use, and that is that terrorists are very adaptive. If you close the big platforms, which are, I would say, almost closed to terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda or ISIL, they will move to others. And they will even go down. They will go to the darknet. They will go to encrypted messaging. And that is the problems we're seeing today. We are coming up very soon with a report that will highlight this trend that we're seeing of moving from bigger platforms to smaller or to encrypted technologies.
Terrific. Eric?
Quick, I don't want to interrupt the flow, but just quickly, I have a very good friend who works at one of the big four companies, and he agrees with my assessment that there's no real evidence to support that the stuff that is being shown on these big social media platforms are the real drivers of the radicalization. And he says, we know this internally. I keep reporting up that it's, there's no research to support this. And I've been told basically to shut up, and that we're under so much pressure as a company to do stuff that we have to just do it and don't ask questions. We just got to do it.
So at Brookings and the Prevention Project, are you able to elevate? I found that a very original insight that I just hadn't thought about because our obsession has been in the other place. Is there, I assume is there any way that you're looking at crystallizing that I think it's a very interesting point.
We're looking at it from a slightly different dimension because I'm not in the technology space,
Right.
so it's harder for me to sort of penetrate that intellectually, let alone actually. But it's more, if you're not emphasizing the social media, the technology component, what you're emphasizing then is the drivers, and the drivers are often government infused, and the behavior of governments towards their people. And one of the reasons why we're focusing so much attention on the narrative and social media issues is because we don't want to tackle the really hard questions about how governments interact with their citizens.
Well, thank you. Now, I would love to jump both to Elisabeth and to Faisal, who can hopefully bring out the other dimensions, another human dimension of this. And I want to share with if I may, besides just a regular deep dive into all things Yemeni right now, Elisabeth has become an expert at looking at and becoming a critic of jihadist poetry. And that may sound irrelevant, and it's not at all. And I spent some of the afternoon looking at some of your thoughts and writing and how identity is built, how community is built, how some of these issues of communication occur. And I'm interested both in what's unfolding there, but whether you see opportunity to look at this. Eric a minute ago mentioned silos. And I often wonder when at a forum like this, where you've got so many different dimensions of the kind of counter-terrorism crowd here, but whether or not there are bank shots, there are dimensions out there we hadn't thought of so that we're not as siloed as in some of this discussion we might be. So I hope you'll add some of the poetry dimension. And then we're going to go to Faisal to talk a little bit about what you do with manpower building, education, the youth question. We had the foreign minister open this session yesterday in what I thought were remarkably candid terms of not wanting the youth to be safe havens for radical ideologies and how you deal with that. So we'll jump with Elisabeth and to Faisal. Elisabeth?
Hi, thank you. Steve, I'm impressed. I gave a few pointers on what I wanted to talk about today, and they certainly didn't include poetry.
I ignored them.
But I'm glad you did mention it, because let me just start by saying technology and 21st century stressors. You wouldn't normally think of poetry, would you? But this is the power of it. When the web pages are taken down, the Twitter feeds are removed, the Facebook groups are closed, the poetry that militant jihad groups produce, and they produce vast amounts of it, stays, because it's an oral narrative and it remains in the collective memory and you can't get rid of it. So it sticks around and has an endurance factor, which no matter how much you try to put pressure on the big four companies, it's not going to go away. But this brings me to Yemen, and I was asked today to do a deep dive on what's happening in Yemen. Poetry actually featured, according to my research, as it appeared on about 20% of output of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So, it is hugely important in Yemen. My other research shows that poetry is important or very important in the daily lives of 74% of Yemenis, daily lives. And that's according to data I collected in the east of Yemen, exactly around the areas where Al-Qaeda was able to launch its state in 2015. But I'll refer you to some of my written work on that. We won't spend my entire 7 minutes talking about poetry. Yemen tends to have lost out of the spotlight because focus has been on Islamic State, which is not big in Yemen, and on Iraq and on Syria. And there has been a general feeling that We don't need to worry about Yemen because the coalition has it in hand. That is very wrong, and I'm going to explain why. The Yemen war can be dated from 2015 when a coalition led by Saudi Arabia entered into airstrikes on Yemen at the request of the so-called legitimate government that had been ousted by rebels in the north known as Houthis, who are nominally and to a lesser extent materially supported by Iran. You can see where this is heading. This is heading towards a sectarian narrative of Sunni versus Shiite. This fed directly into the kinds of narratives that jihad groups were producing. Us against them, Sunni versus Shiite, believers versus unbelievers, etc. So the rhetoric of the Gulf around the Yemen war actually gave militant jihad a great boost in Yemen. Al-Qaeda was able to launch essentially a state, which it ran for a whole year until April 2016. It had revenue, because one unforeseen consequence of the Saudi naval blockade, nominally to stop weapons from Iran coming into Yemen, practically to starve a population, perhaps unintentionally, but nonetheless. This gave Al-Qaeda the opportunity to bring in everything that Yemeni needed along the coastline in the east, which it controlled, over 1,000 kilometers of coastline. And so it grew very rich. And so it launched community development projects, filling that space, as we've heard time and again this conference, that space that's left by a failed state, a state vacuum. But let me bring this up to date. In 2017 and 2018, now, this is no longer the case. Counter-terrorism operations have had some degree of success against Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, and on paper, it now looks pretty good. They haven't gone away. In 2017, Al-Qaeda was still able to launch 273 operations, all domestic, all inside Yemen, all small scale. And this year, however, that number has gone down by about 2/3. Why? And here, I'll just move into the stressors. Well, technology is one reason, and my colleagues here, Eric and David, as well as Daniel Byman yesterday, have been careful to say that technology works both ways. It's a blessing and it's a curse. From the counterterrorism point of view, the United States, during 2017, launched over 120 drone strikes in Yemen and 8 airstrikes. That's 4 times as many as in 2016, and yes, it had an impact. What happened as a result was that we saw jihad groups fragmenting. That means it's much more difficult for them to communicate. They themselves imposed a technology ban on themselves in January this year, saying all mujahideen are to get off the internet and to stop using cell phones. They launched 3 spy films, one in January, one in August, and one which I was up late last night watching. It just came out yesterday. And they attribute over 400 mujahideen deaths directly to information leaks. But what was interesting, actually, in the spy films was that fragmentation was a goal of Western counterterrorism, not just droning. And the confessions from spies that were shown on camera last night showed that they were told more important than providing us with information for drone strikes is creating rifts inside the groups and trying to stir up doubts and suspicions between the brothers. This has worked to some extent. What I'm concerned about is what's going to happen now, because these are very short-term policies. Droning is short-term, Stirring up rifts has turned out to be short-term. They've been discovered. The brothers are healing their rifts. What is going to happen next? Well, we have a situation right now in Yemen that looks like we have inter-jihad conflict between Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. This is really interesting. It possibly could happen on other fronts too, that actual armed conflict erupts. We saw this in July when Islamic State kidnapped and killed, allegedly killed, 13 Al-Qaeda members. And this is being touted around in some think tanks in Washington as some kind of apocalyptic showdown between the different jihad groups. It doesn't feel like that on the ground. And I'm one of the few people who is lucky enough to still be able to go into Yemen. I was there 8 weeks ago in the east, in the old Al-Qaeda territories. And I've also been invited into their encrypted groups on apps like Telegram. So I have quite a good feeling for how they're thinking and feeling. This feels like stirred up rivalries that have been latched onto within certain tribes and then given the labels Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. On the ground, jihad is much more fluid, and loyalties are much more fluid. Indeed, we're seeing that by some of the Mujahideen just being bought over to the United Arab Emirates-backed forces. What the complaints are against Islamic State by Al-Qaeda give a flavor of that. Basically, they're saying they're lazy, they don't get up before lunchtime, they're only interested in photo shoots, they pitch their camp next to ours, they rip open their tents, and they drive through our checkpoints. So it's all very sort of teenage. I will finish up in 1 minute. What are the conditions under which the Mujahideen might regroup again? So what are the stresses, in a sense, from our point of view, not from their point of view? First, and ironically, peace. If peace is achieved in Yemen, this could actually lead to a resurgence of jihad, because there will be so many sectors of the population who are left out and who are disillusioned, particularly if peace is under the rubric of the current UN resolution. Second, coalition violations. These are not exaggerated. There are over 20 secret prisons in Yemen, forced disappearances, imam assassinations. These are breeding new jihad. Third, youth. Battlefronts are the new recruiting ground, not tribes. Front lines, orphans, 2.2 million children out of school. This is a recipe for disaster. Penultimately, sectarianism. This is growing. The Arab World Youth Survey showed that of the ordinary population, not just Mujahideen, over 80% of youth fear growing sectarianism in Yemen and fear it's getting stronger. And finally, water. There is a water crisis that everyone is ignoring in Yemen because the war is what everybody's looking at. But actually, in about 15 to 20 years' time, there will be no water left and the aquifer will have run out. I do have a few solutions in mind, but I'll wait to be asked.
It's great. David had a quick two-finger.
Just a quick point to say that we're not holding the view that if you push down the 4 companies, problems will be solved. And the way I see it is very similar to what Elisabeth just said, is that this is a holistic problem that requires holistic solution, meaning you have to do everything of everything. You have to deal sometimes militarily with problems. You have to work with governments on making sure that the approaches they have are supporting the life of their citizens in respecting their fundamental liberties. And you have to understand also that sometimes there will be people who will be attracted to certain message because of their individual issues, because of their problems with their government, or because of their community issues, and you have also to deal with that. If you think about the longer-term problems to our issues, you have to hear what Faisal has to say.
We're going to go to Faisal. I just need to say and put a punctuation point that the world, at least my impression, the world that Eric and David had described, but particularly Eric, about local stakeholders and the level of analysis being at a certain level and kind of dealing in the various dimensions, that world sounds so distant from the world that you're operating in the reality there. It might be interesting to come in and look at what practices. I know, Eric, you're involved with something called the Global Solutions Exchange, which is a sort of show and tell of what can be done out there. But, big question is, in a place like Yemen or war-torn spots, whether there's a relevance in some of that to these places or whether they're beyond help and you simply need to contain them. Faisal, let me just tell the audience, Silatech, as I understand it, is an international social development organization, a nonprofit NGO that tries to work with youth and get jobs and resources and sustain enterprises. So you're sort of the startup guy and youth guy, and I suppose you're the one tasked now with fixing all these problems. So fix them.
أشكرك. مساء الخير جميعا، وأشكر المنظمين على الدعوة. وما سأتناوله هو متكامل مع ذكره الأخ رك. بداية قبل الدخول في موضوع اليوم، أرغب بالتحدث قليلا عن المؤسسة وما تقوم به المؤسسة، تعريف بسيط ومن ثم منهجية العمل بالمؤسسة وما هو أثر عملنا، وأخيرا موضوع اليوم وهو مشروع الأمل للعائدين من الحرب. المؤسسة تقوم بعملها من خلال 3 أذرع، من خلال إدارة ريادة المشاريع، ومن خلال إدارة التوظيف، ومن خلال إدارة الدراسات والبحوث. عند دخولنا في أي بلد لأول مرة تقوم إدارة الدراسات والبحوث بدراسة نسب البطالة، كيفية تطبيق المشاريع في هذه الدول، ومن ثم تخرج بمقترحات لكيفية عمل المشاريع، أما من خلال إدارة ريادة المشاريع أم من خلال إدارة التوظيف. بكل بساطة إدارة ريادة المشاريع هي إدارة تتعاون مع مؤسسات الإقراض الصغرى لمنح قروض لريادي الأعمال للقيام بأعمالهم. أما فيما يتعلق بإدارة التوظيف، فإدارة التوظيف هي تقوم إدارة تربط الباحثين عن عمل باحتياجات سوق العمل وتحاول تقليل الفارق بين احتياجات سوق العمل من خلال توفير دورات تدريبية وتأهيلية لربطهم بالوظائف الشاغرة في البلد. ونستخدم في ذلك بعض المنصات الإلكترونية، منها منصة تعمل. منصة تعمل هي بالشراكة بين مؤسسة صلاتك وشركة مايكروسوفت. المنصة هذه تمنح الباحثين عن عمل كتابة السيرة الذاتية، توجد ما يفوق 700 دورة تدريبية. المنصة موجودة ب3 لغات، العربية والإنجليزية والفرنسية. المنصة اليوم موجودة ب9 نسخ، 8 نسخ منها في 8 دول.
What countries?
في مصر، قطر، تونس، المغرب، الجزائر. قريبا سوف نطلق في دول أخرى، وتوجد نسخة يطلق عليها النسخة العامة أو الريجنال فيرجن، اللي هي تستخدم في أي دولة عدا الدول 8. طبعا سبب إنشاء بوابات فرعية في الدول هذه هي للتركيز على الوظائف في الدولة نفسها. يعني على سبيل المثال، عند الدخول على بوابة قطر تعمل، فأنت ترى الوظائف الموجودة في قطر، لأن الباحثين عن الوظائف في قطر هم من سيقومون بالدخول على البوابة قطر تعمل للتسجيل بها أو للبحث عن فرص عمل. هذا بشكل مختصر ما تقوم به المؤسسة منها. طيب، المؤسسة من خلال اطلاعها على بعض المعلومات المسربة من داعش تحديدا، وهي لعدد 3803 أشخاص. طبعا هاي الأرقام حصلنا عليها من البنك الدولي ونشرت في عام 2016. الغريب في الموضوع أن 30% من 3803 أشخاص هم من حملة الشهادة الجامعية، و82% منهم هم من حملة الشهادة الثانوية، و2 منهم يعني الأقل هم من عدم حملة المؤهلات العلمية. فالسؤال المطروح الآن، معنى ذلك أن المؤهلين علميا لم يمنعهم الانخراط بالجماعات الإرهابية أو المتطرفة. فقد ذكرت أن المؤهلات العلمية لم تمنع الأشخاص من الانخراط في الجماعات الإرهابية. فبتحليل الموضوع المؤسسة تقوم بشكل أساسي على أساليب وقائية وأساليب علاجية. الأساليب الوقائية هي من خلال توفير فرص العمل للشباب أينما وجدوا، سواء في المدن أم في الحدود للمناطق القريبة من الجماعات المتطرفة. نأتي الآن إلى الأساليب العلاجية، وهو موضوع اليوم العائدين من الحرب. قمنا بالتعاون مع الحكومة السودانية بعمل مشروع مصغر بايلوت عبارة عن 400 شخص عائدين من الحرب، بالتعاون مع مجموعة من المؤسسات في السودان، منها وزارة الصحة ووزارة الأوقاف والشؤون الإسلامية، وزارة الداخلية، مع مجموعة كبيرة من المؤسسات الحكومية، حتى نتكاتف ونحاول إرجاع الأشخاص هؤلاء إلى الحياة الطبيعية وإلى المجتمع وإخراطهم في المجتمع، وتقديم فرصة عمل لهم من جديد حتى يكونوا نموذج. وإذا نجح هذا النموذج أو هذا الاختبار ممكن أن يعمم على دول أخرى من قبل سواء منظمتنا أم أي من المنظمات الأخرى. فبالتعاون فالبرنامج هو عبارة عن إعادة تأهيل نفسي، إعادة تأهيل ديني، إعادة تأهيل ذهني، لإخضاعهم للتقبل للرجوع إلى المجتمع مرة أخرى. ونعتقد إن شاء الله بعد انتهاء البرنامج ونجاحه بإذن الله يعتبر هذا جزء من الأعمال التي تقوم بها المؤسسة، واللي هي حاليا تعمل في 17 دولة. المؤسسة تعمل اليوم في 17 دولة، وإن شاء الله خلال العام القادم سوف نتوسع إلى 23 دولة. حاليا نعمل في 16 دولة عربية، بالإضافة إلى تركيا للاجئين السوريين تحديدا. المؤسسة لديها شراكات كثيرة، ما يفوق 300 شراكة، من مؤسسات أممية، من مؤسسات حكومية، شبه حكومية، مؤسسات خاصة. يعني يمكن على سبيل المثال لا يمكن أن نتطرق مؤسسات الأممية، مؤسسات الاتحاد الأوروبي، البنك الدولي، حتى بالمؤسسات الخاصة، يعني مايكروسوفت، جي بي مورغان، بوينغ، جميعها مؤسسات خاصة وليست حكومية، بنوك، مؤسسات تعليمية، MIT وغيرها من المؤسسات. المؤسسة ولله الحمد بنهاية 2017 حققت 650 ألف فرصة عمل، وإلى اليوم في عام 2018 حققت 1,000,000 فرصة عمل، وتعمل على تحقيق 3 ملايين فرصة عمل بنهاية عام 2022. لا أريد الذهاب إلى الفيديو المذكور حتى لا أطيل الوقت. لا أعلم أن مدير الجلسة
You can do it over drinks
أعطاني
later,
بعض
over
التحذيرات
juice.
قبل البدء بكلمتي، أنا ألتزم بالوقت، وأنا على أتم الاستعداد لأي أسئلة.
Thank you so much. I'll leave these on because I want to ask you a quick question. How do you know, I mean, you have a lot of partners up there, but how do you know when you're succeeding, like genuinely succeeding?
نجاحاتنا تكمن في الوظائف التي حققت. الأرقام التي ذكرتها بأن المؤسسة استطاعت إلى اليوم تحقيق 1,000,000 فرصة عمل، فهذا بحد ذاته نجاح.
But jobs offered are different than jobs filled.
المؤسسة تقوم بمراجعة مانحين القروض، يعني احنا لا نمنح الشخص مبالغ بشكل مباشر، وإنما نتابع تحقيق أعماله من خلالنا احنا بشكل مباشر، ومن ثم من خلال ثيرد بارتي، يعني شركة طرف ثالث يقوم بالتأكد هل ما زالت الوظيفة قائمة، هل ما زال الشاب مستمر في عمله. إذا كانت هناك أي عوائق تقنية نقوم بتقديم المساعدات التقنية له، لأن ليس من مصلحتنا فشل الشخص، لأنه ما يترتب على ذلك أنه لن يقوم باستطاعة تسديد القروض هاي، فذلك من مصلحة الجميع أن يقف الشخص ويكمل القيام بمشروعه.
And just, I want to open up to everyone here, but another dimension that has not come up much in the discussion, we've talked about reintegration into communities, rehabilitation into communities. You know, what about the communities? Do the communities want rehabilitated people back in them? You know, is there stigma that comes with returning foreign fighters or those who've been radicalized in any dimension that become hard to make that incorporation hard? So tell us a little bit how you move the communities to be pliable, because my experience, at least in the United States, is communities can be awful. neighborhoods can be awful. And the notion of you have a stigmatized person returning, they're not sitting there with open arms. So how do you solve that problem?
كما ذكرت في المشروع الذي بصدد المضي به في السودان، تشاركت في المشروع مجموعة من المنظمات، كما ذكرت لك وزارة الصحة ووزارة الشؤون الإسلامية ووزارة الداخلية، بالإضافة إلى وزارة الشباب والرياضة. من خلال وزارة الشباب والرياضة ووزارة العمل والشؤون الاجتماعية هم من يقومون بتأهيل المجتمع لتقبل هؤلاء الناس، لأن في النهاية هؤلاء الأفراد ممكن أن يكونوا أخي وأخك، أب لشخص من الأفراد. لذلك يجب أن أتقبل وأشجع هؤلاء الناس للعودة طبيعيا إلى المجتمع.
But Eric, let me ask you, to come back to this question that I just raised with the two of you, and the worlds that you describe are so radically different, but and going back to this morning's meeting, what impressed me with this local dimension of stakeholders, it's along the lines of what Khalid Al-Attiyah talked about a decentralized, almost a modular system for developing that. And I'm wondering if you can bridge to at least the chaos, the fragmentation, and the mess that Elisabeth is intimate with in Yemen, and where your world might be helpful to hers.
I can try to bridge, but I'll probably fall in the ocean. But I think on a number of dimensions, I think there might be a bridge. One is with the increased interest of the World Bank from their Fragility, Conflict, and Violence Unit in steering the bank in the direction of using a CVE or PVE lens when it designs and implements big infrastructure projects. And my hope is that in places like Yemen, that when the bank comes in or is in, that it's applying a CVE or PVE lens to some of this work to mitigate the chances that to increase the likelihood of preventing future violence through its engagements. The other piece is there are some very, very, as I'm sure Elisabeth can attest to better than I, there's some very, very brave activists in Yemen now, some of which are involved in a network called the Women's Alliance for Security Leadership, which is a partner of ours through the Global Solutions Exchange, working at a very community level on some PVE, not calling it PVE or CVE, but working to engage in communities, promote tolerance, and try to bridge some divides between different parts of communities. They're doing it under great duress. They're often their stories aren't able to be told and shared. They're not able to link up with civil society partners around the world because of visa issues that are getting more and more pressing. There are islands of not progress but success, but it's a question of creating the ecosystem to connect those islands to something that's more sustainable. But absent ending of conflict, it's hard to imagine how this can be, or subsiding of conflict. It's hard to imagine this.
Elisabeth, do you want to try to bridge over to Eric and without falling into the ocean?
See if we can do this. So yes, I agree with the speakers on this panel, especially Faisal, but also for the whole conference. We've all been saying that one of the key solutions is community development and community investment projects. And that was very clear in the powerful film last night that Francesca showed. But governments have been investing tens of millions in Yemen for a very long time. The problem is it's always top down, and it's not, maybe with the exception, a few exceptions such as your own, it's not bottom up. And as a result, it's tainted, and much of it is siphoned off via corrupt enterprises. We've just had the announcement last week. Saudi Arabia will put $70 million into education. What's it going to do? Build the King Salman City of Education in a desert area in the remote east. Who's going to go to this university? It needs to start at grassroots. It needs to start small scale. But the problem is, the areas are too remote, they're too difficult, they're too insecure, and the projects are too cheap. And therefore, international aid agencies aren't that interested. This is precisely why these are the areas where militant jihadist groups take off and fill the vacuum. So that's the gap we need to bridge.
And that, just briefly, that's one reason why I have a sliver of hope that if the World Bank gets smarter about how it sort of influence where its investments are directed in a country, that it could mitigate some of this problem going forward. I'm not overly optimistic that this will happen, but there's certainly more thinking about this in World Bank headquarters than there has been before about how to connect the dots here.
Right.
So it gives me some hope.
In the audience, Vivi van Ginkel has asked a question of Faisal about the effectiveness of the Silatech project, and he suggests that figures show that the program helps young people get jobs, but as some of us have mentioned, and as the director of the Doha, Brookings Doha Center mentioned yesterday, that doesn't necessarily correlate with people not, engaging and becoming part of violent extremism. You sort of alluded to that too, actually, I thought, in your comments. And I'm just wondering, what are the other dimensions of an ecosystem, a healthy ecosystem, that takes what Silatech is doing but fills in some of the other gaps? So, I mean, I don't ask this question facetiously, but what's missing that would be helpful that you don't have happening on the counter-violence issue?
نحن كمؤسسة ذكرت في البداية أن المؤسسة تساعد ولا تقضي. من الصعب القضاء على هذه الظواهر من خلال مؤسسة واحدة، بينما يتطلب الأمر تكاتف جميع المؤسسات والمنظمات العالمية لمحاولة القضاء. وأعتقد أن الموضوع يستغرق وقت طويل جدا. فالأرقام التي تبين، يعني كما ذكرت، إلى اليوم نحن قمنا بتوفير 1,000,000 فرصة عمل. 1,000,000 فرصة عمل أمام أعداد البطالة الموجودة في العالم رقم جدا ضئيل، ولكن هذه جهد مؤسسة واحدة. ونعتقد أن إذا قامت مؤسسات مماثلة بنفس العمل سنصل إلى نسبة معقولة لمحاولة تخفيف أو لنصل إلى يوم من الأيام للقضاء على البطالة والفقر والأمور هذه.
When James Foley was killed and beheaded by ISIS, I had known James, and I put out a picture on Twitter of him and said, this is the way I'd like to see him remembered. And I was quickly besieged by ISIS followers on Twitter and others. And I decided, rather than just calling Ali Soufan and his FBI buddies, to try and engage some of them in a conversation about what they viewed about modernity, where their smartphones came from, how they thought they were communicating. And about, 50, 60% of the people were absolutely awful, threatened to kill me, etc. They sort of got tired and disappeared. But then I had real exchanges with people who were clearly advocates for ISIS, but they had brains, they were thinking. I asked them about how they were going to develop smartphones in the caliphate. And you just saw there were people there who could be connected with at some level. And I was pretty surprised and shocked by this. So I look at that as an opportunity, in a way, for reaching out. And because I had that experience, I don't know how we are trying. I listened to, I won't mention the name just because we were under Chatham House rules, about the efforts to do more of this connecting or to do counter-messaging and counter-programming. But in my one experience over the James Foley killing, I felt I was dealing with people who had never, ever had that kind of conversation via Twitter, but had never really connected with someone who was trying to meet them in some way about what they were all about. So from that perspective of using technology as a slightly different platform, what do you think we can do? You're an attorney, you're a lawyer, you're going to be speaking at this big cyber tech conference in January. So what would you do to address that dimension of reaching people who are part of, I would call, the problem equation?
I would say in general, this is the challenge. I mean, how to communicate with these people in a way that is effective. And I am not aware of a solution that can say, we are 100% effective, and I'm not aware of a solution that could say we have 50 rates of success. Because of so many reasons. To begin with, we don't have enough evidence. I mean, if somebody, because of a conversation, does not engage in activity today, it doesn't necessarily mean that he will not engage in terrorist activity a year from now.
Right.
What we know more today is what doesn't work. And we are able to say, okay, we are not good enough in knowing what works, but we know that this, and that wouldn't work. And messages from governments are particularly ineffective. Messages from people who do not have the trust of those individuals will also be ineffective, as well as the attempt to shut down everything. So we have a kind of a box in which we say, we know this doesn't work, let's try inside. And we're still testing, and we're trying, as from the Security Council perspective, to be a good convener of this dialogue and to bring more experience from states, from local level, from researchers, into a dialogue that we hold once a year on this issue, and several of the participants here have spoken in our events. But one point that Faisal mentioned, and it's very interesting, and I want to touch because you started this panel with the issue of technology. Basically, what Faisal's NGO does is basically bringing technology to those people. These people are masters of tweeting and masters of using their iPhones, and perhaps even master of creating video clips that attract us for hours and perhaps stick with us. But they don't know how to write their own CV. And they don't know how to apply to a company like Boeing or Microsoft or Morgan Stanley or other companies that you mentioned.
So other skill sets.
It's the same technology that allows them to propagate the agenda, which is inhibiting them from actually applying to jobs that they were able to place them eventually.
Right. Eric?
Can I just jump in on your question about the sort of the one-to-one engagement you had on Twitter? And I think there's actually a larger initiative that's run by the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in London called Counter-Conversation, and they're doing, I think, exactly that in a more sort of strategic, organized way. It's not sort of just individually. It's an organization doing it and engaging with people online that want to then. They find some cognitive opening and then they have the conversation. The issue is, how do you transfer that into an offline environment where whatever needs, whatever grievances, whatever issues are identified in the conversation can then be addressed in the real world. And I think that's where we're stuck. We're stuck with these parallel universes. The online engagement where there's some success sometimes, but what do we do with, how do we translate that into a way that will actually make durable success in the person's life, as opposed to just a good conversation with Steve Clemons?
Which is haphazard and in the middle of the night. We have time just for a couple of quick other things real quick, but Eric, we got a question from Daniel Ahmed, who mentions that today is World Cities Day. Who knew? I just looked at it as Halloween. And asked, really, when it comes to resiliency, the theme of this year, and just ask you very short form, what are two or the three best practices that urban regions can deploy that make them more resilient to violent extremists and dealings? Just name a couple.
Yeah, off the top of my head, and I mentioned one already. The Compact program in New South Wales, I think, is a great model. It's long.
Is this somewhere like? Do you? Because do you have like a
somewhere? Yeah. What do you mean somewhere?
You know, like an Eric Rosand, like top 10 good places. You should.
I do, but depending
Yeah.
on the issue. I mean, it's
Yeah.
not, you know, but
But so New South Wales, who else is great?
New South Wales, working on community resilience with grant making, networking.
Does Qatar get anything right?
Qatar gets a lot of things right, but I'm just not, you know, as aware of the details as I should be. But in places like London and increasingly Manchester, it's often in reaction to attacks. When cities do a stock taking, they realize that there are not enough open spaces for dialogue, there are not enough public services to certain parts of the community, there's not enough, you know, certain parts of the city don't have access to job postings in the way other parts of the city have. And this is all in the response to an attack, how they think about how their sort of the city services are provided. There's not enough opportunities for youth to engage with their elected officials. These are all sort of often poo-pooed as too soft, too disconnected. But just I think Manchester, after the attack at in the concert last year, the year before, they just had a commission release a study where it talked about all sorts of issues where the members of marginalized communities were feeling marginalized and why there was more receptivity perhaps to radical ideas than one would have thought. And it often had to do with feeling disconnected from the city they're living in.
I'm going to ask that Elisabeth and Faisal just to clean this up here. I just have to mention there are two wonderful questions for Elisabeth. One from Akinola Olojo, and we don't have enough time for it, but he did research on 19th century Sokoto jihad and the poetry of Nana Asmau. So there's a common traveler out there. And I think broadly I wanted to ask you just in real short form, are there opportunities, again, in this nice non-siloed way, to reach these communities with other dimensions of poetry, as you talked about it? Can it go both ways? You talked about technology going both ways. Can poetry go both ways is one question. And then for both of you, as you think about filling out more capacity, someone asked about can technology and whatever help with the water crisis? What else can technology be used to fill the deficits on that may be lurking out there? So let me go to poetry and water, and then what you think we can bring technology to address some of the other deficits. Elisabeth?
I think that's a terrific question. I can see with the first chap we could have a riveting conversation for a very long time, but not in public. Poetry can go both ways, yes. The key point here is that it cannot be manufactured. So we cannot sit in, I don't know, Langley or Cheltenham drumming up poems or trying to write them ourselves. It has to be authentic and written, written by local populations. This stuff is being produced. Poetry that is about the kinds of themes that would resonate in a CVE environment, peace, toleration, etc. But it's not being gathered together well to magnify its impact. What the Mujahideen do is that they gather these things together, they put them out in their Telegram groups, they do public recitations, and it takes off. Maybe we could do the same, but we can't make it. Looming water crisis, I know nothing about technology, but I imagine that if attention were given to this problem, there would be solutions. Our biggest problem is it's not getting any attention because we're all too busy with the war. Solving the war would be a very good start.
Faisal.
نحن نؤمن بالمنصات الإلكترونية أنها تساعد كثيرا. يمكن تطرقت أثناء حديثي لمنصة تعمل، ولكن من ضمن أيضا المنصات الأخرى التي نعمل عليها هي منصة خدماتي. هي منصة للمهنيين، بحيث أنها تقوم يعني كل شخص مهني يمتهن مهنة معينة سواء كان نجار حداد يقوم بالتسجيل على البوابة، فعند وجود أي خلل ببيتك تستطيع الدخول على المنصة الإلكترونية وتقوم بالبحث عن أقرب شخص إليك يمتهن المهنة هذه، فتصل له طلبات الريكوست ويقوم بالاستجابة إليك يعني بفكرة بسيطة تقدر أن تخلق فرص عمل لأعداد كبيرة من الناس جدا.